Rescue of a woman destined for sacrifice.
The rescue of a woman destined for sacrifice. In the chilling dusk of November 4, 2019, the tranquil city of Brunswick, Georgia, became the stage for a sinister drama. Javier Sanchez Mendoza, his face obscured by a purple bandana, lunged at a woman who was watching over children playing outside a daycare. With a knife pressed to her throat, he dragged her into his silver truck, her screams piercing the air. A witness, breathless with terror, dialed 911 and reported the horrifying scene. "He was so fast. We saw him grab her and shove her into the truck. He has a knife," she was screaming. Menzies' truck sped away, heading towards a small cemetery. There, under the looming oak trees, he began to beat the woman, intending to discard her lifeless body among the graves. But the daycare worker fought back, desperately grappling for the knife, which eventually fell out of reach, between the truck's console and seat. Frustrated, Mendoza altered his plan and drove her further away, towards his home in Giza. On the way, Mendoza made a chilling call to his contact in Mexico, allegedly a gang associate. He switched the call to speaker, allowing the terrified woman to hear their discussion about where she should meet her grisly end, Mexico or the US. Meanwhile, Ronnie Cooper, a seasoned officer with the Glynn County Police Department, was driving home after a long shift when he heard the distressing radio broadcast, "Daycare worker kidnapped, suspect armed with a knife, northbound, silver truck." Cooper sped north, coordinating with colleagues tracking the victim's cell phone signal. He called his partner, Jeremy Stagner, an FBI task force officer. Together, they raced along Highway 341, while Mendoza laid out a large tarp in preparation for a sacrificial ritual. As Cooper and Stagner arrived in Giza, they spotted Menzies' truck parked outside his mobile home. Giza police called for a SWAT team, but the officers knew they couldn't wait. Concealed behind the ancient oaks, they watched Mendoza step outside to make a call. In a swift, silent move, they tackled him to the ground. Inside the mobile home, Cooper found the woman, her face slashed, bleeding onto a statue of Santa Muerte, the Mexican folk saint of death. Gang members revered this figure, believing she could shield them from law enforcement. Candles flickered around the altar as Mendoza had made offerings of fruit, liquor, and the woman's blood and hair. Her name and birth date were scrawled on a piece of paper, placed alongside an upside-down photograph on the altar. The victim's eyes widened in despair at the sight of the grisly tableau. Federal prosecutor Greg Gillilei later commented, "If they had waited for the SWAT team, it would have been too late." Even after his capture, Mendoza threatened the woman's life and her family's, screaming in Spanish at the officers. Cooper used a translation app to decipher his threats. The investigation, led by Homeland Security Investigations, revealed that Mendoza was part of an extensive human trafficking network, victimizing around 71,000 people from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. The kidnapped woman was but one, among many. She had been recruited under the guise of working on farms through the H-2A visa program for seasonal agricultural workers. The scheme, prosecutors alleged, had operated since at least 2015, potentially linked to Mexican crime syndicates, and had profited over $200 million. Victims were often charged exorbitant fees to escape the program and enter the US illegally. This case highlighted that Mexican gangs were profiting not only from drug trafficking, but also from the modern-day slavery of human trafficking. Thousands of victims in rural coastal Georgia lived in fear, hiding from their captors who threatened them and their families back home. Experts say human trafficking is a far more widespread issue than many Americans realize. It's happening across the United States, prosecutor Gillilei emphasized. During the trial, Homeland Security agent Julio Lopez testified that he had interviewed over 200 victims of the labor scam, many of whom were non-English speaking, impoverished, and threatened by their traffickers. Mendoza, though in the US illegally, had posed as a farm labor contractor for the H-2A visa program. Using aliases, he became a leader within the criminal network, claiming to earn $27,000 a month, though prosecutors suspected his earnings were even higher. He recruited the kidnapped woman and 564 others for seasonal farm work. Many victims were exploited by being forced to pay illegal fees and live in deplorable conditions without the promised pay. The Savannah Morning News reported this as one of the largest human trafficking cases ever prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice. Mendoza made trips to Mexico to recruit workers, bringing 565 laborers into the U.S. They were charged illegal visa processing fees, often up to $1,000, and forced to work without pay to settle these debts, a practice known as debt bondage. He controlled where the workers lived and worked. When the kidnapped woman and 37 others arrived in the U.S. in September 2018, Mendoza confiscated their passports. He pointed at her and declared she would be his wife. To ensure her compliance, Mendoza threatened her and her family in Mexico, including her young son. The woman, whose identity remains protected, had believed she would work briefly in the U.S. to earn money for her family back home. Instead, Mendoza forced her to live with him and obey his commands. Gilalai stated, "It was about power and control. If she didn't do what he wanted, she would be punished." Mendoza coerced her into signing English documents in a Georgia courthouse, claiming they were married. No legal marriage documents were found, and it would have been illegal as the woman was under duress. In Mendoza's twisted mind, she belonged to him. "Chains are not always visible," Gilalai remarked. "She came here seeking happiness but found hell." In her testimony, the woman recounted mustering the courage to call the police in 2019 when Mendoza attempted to rape and strangle her. She borrowed a phone from one of the two men living in Mendoza's mobile home and called 911. The men tried to protect her as Mendoza chased them with a knife. This incident led to Mendoza's imprisonment for 2 months. While Mendoza was jailed, the men helped her escape to Brunswick, but he kidnapped her again on November 4, 2019. In 2021, Mendoza pleaded guilty to conspiracy to engage in forced labor in federal court in Brunswick. Prosecutors noted that at the time of his arrest, over 300 men and women in Mexico were preparing to work for him, having paid illegal fees. During sentencing, Mendoza knelt before the judge, begging for mercy. Prosecutors sought a life sentence.
What do you think about this issue?
The judge sentenced
Please leave a
Mendoza
comment
to
below
30
for everyone
years
to
in
know and
federal
discuss.
prison, without the
Goodbye
possibility
and see you
of
again.
parole.